The summer of 1938 had not been kind to Earl Whitmore. By August, his corn was knee-high when it should have been shoulder-high. The bank had already sent 2 letters. His mule, the big gray one he called Chester, had gone lame in June and hadn't recovered. And here he stood at the edge of a county equipment auction in rural central Illinois, 43 years old, with $6.30 in his shirt pocket and no real plan. Then someone wheeled in the Farmall F-20. It was used, obviously. The red paint had faded to something closer to rust and memory. One of the rear fender brackets was bent, but the engine turned over when the auctioneer's man cranked it, and that 4-cylinder fired up and settled into a low, steady idle that Earl would later describe as sounding like something that meant business. The bidding opened at $4. Nobody moved. The auctioneer called again. Still nothing. Earl raised his hand for $5, and then the gavel came down before he'd even fully exhaled. $5. He drove it home that afternoon on a borrowed flatbed, and in less than 30 days, he had harvested more acres than he'd managed in the previous 2 seasons combined. The bank did not send a 3rd letter. That's the thing about the Farmall F-20. It wasn't the most powerful machine International Harvester ever built. It wasn't the flashiest or the fastest. But in the hands of men and women who needed it most, during the worst decade American agriculture ever endured, it was precisely enough. And that, it turns out, is a kind of genius all its own. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying this reached me. Not about the action's size, but its meaning. Hit it if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and comment your thoughts on this story. Let's complete this circle together. Now, back to where this machine came from. To understand the F-20, you have to understand what came before it, and what was falling apart around it. By the late 1920s, International Harvester had already changed farming once. The original Farmall, the one they'd call the regular after successors arrived, had introduced the concept of the row crop tractor to American agriculture. Before it, farmers used horses for cultivation and tractors for heavy draft work. The Farmall merged those jobs into one machine. It could straddle crop rows on its tricycle front end, pull a plow, run a belt drive for a thresher, and do it all on fuel that cost far less than feed. Farmers noticed, but the regular had its limits. Horsepower was modest, around 9 at the drawbar in real-world conditions. For smaller operations, that was fine. For men trying to expand acreage, to squeeze productivity out of every acre before the bank came calling, it wasn't always enough. The International Harvester's answer arrived in 1932. They called it the Farmall F-20. The designation wasn't arbitrary. The 20 pointed toward the machine's rated power, nominally 20 horsepower at the belt pulley, which translated to roughly 16 belt horsepower and around 12 at the drawbar under Nebraska tractor test conditions. That might sound modest to modern ears. But in 1932, on a mid-size American farm, 12 drawbar horsepower meant you could pull a 2-bottom plow through heavy Illinois clay without killing the engine. It meant you could run a grain elevator, a corn sheller, a threshing machine. It meant one tractor doing the work that previously required multiple horses, multiple men, and considerably more patience. The engine itself was a 220.9 cubic inch 4-cylinder. Cast iron block, cast iron head, running on distillate or kerosene after warming up on gasoline. That fuel flexibility mattered enormously during the Depression years, when every cent of operating cost was scrutinized. Distillate was cheaper than gasoline. Farmers who could save money on fuel could survive a little longer. The F-20 let them make that choice. It weighed around 3,600 pounds in standard configuration, which gave it enough traction to be useful without being so heavy it compacted fields or bogged down in wet spring soil. The rear tires, steel lugs in the early years, yet optional rubber by the mid-1930s, could be adjusted in width to match different row spacings. That adjustability was the point. IH had designed the entire F-20 around the idea that one machine needed to serve many farms, many crops, many conditions. And it did. Between 1932 and 1939, International Harvester built over 148,000 Farmall F-20s. That number alone tells you something. These weren't bought in good times by optimistic men with money to spend. But the F-20's entire production run unfolded inside the Great Depression. Every one of those 148,000 machines was purchased by someone who had weighed the cost carefully, who had probably delayed the decision, who had made the choice because they genuinely could not afford not to. That's a different kind of sales story than we usually tell about machinery. The mechanical layout of the F-20 followed the row crop formula that Farmall had pioneered: narrow front axle, wide rear stance, high crop clearance. The operator sat over the rear axle, close to the work, with good sight lines down to the row middles. Cultivation was the F-20's native language. Pull a two-row cultivator behind it, set the sweeps correctly, and a careful driver could work through corn at several acres per hour without significantly damaging the crop. That mattered because cultivation wasn't optional in that era. Herbicides were decades away. If you didn't mechanically control weeds between the rows, and they would cut your yield. The F-20 let one man do what otherwise took a team. The power takeoff ran at 536 RPM, a standard that IH helped establish across the industry. That meant implements designed for one farmall would work on another, would work across different farms, could be borrowed or rented or shared across a community. Standardization sounds like a bureaucratic achievement. On a Depression-era farm, it meant neighbors could pool resources and survive. So belt pulley horsepower gets overlooked now, but it was central to how these tractors were actually used. The F-20's belt pulley, positioned on the right side of the engine, could run stationary equipment for hours. Baling operations, feed grinding, water pumping, sawmill work, all of it ran off that pulley. During winter months when field work stopped, the tractor didn't. It kept earning. Earl Whitmore's F-20 ran a corn sheller through the winter of 1938 and into 1939. He charged neighboring farmers 2 cents a bushel to shell their corn, and by the time spring planting season arrived, he had repaid most of his outstanding debt to the bank. The tractor had cost him $5. The income from that corn sheller run was over $120. The F-20 was eventually replaced by the Farmall H in 1939, a more refined machine with a higher compression engine, improved hydraulics, and better fuel efficiency. The H was unquestionably the better tractor by engineering measure. But something happened to the F-20 machines already out in the world. They simply kept working. Because the F-20 had been built with a durability that was partly intentional and partly a function of the era's metallurgy and design philosophy, these tractors refused to quit. Farmers who couldn't afford newer machines kept running their F-20s through the 1940s. Through the war years when parts were prioritized for military production, into the 1950s when neighbors were upgrading to live hydraulics and diesel engines. The F-20 was still there, still starting, still pulling. There are verified accounts of Farmall F-20 tractors that remained in active field service into the 1960s, nearly 30 years after they left the factory. When you consider that these machines worked in conditions that included mud, ice, summer heat over 100 degrees, and operators who sometimes maintained them carefully and sometimes didn't maintain them at all, that longevity is extraordinary. A lot of that comes down to the simplicity of the design. There was no hydraulic system to fail, no complex electrical architecture to chase down. The magneto ignition was robust and field repairable. The transmission had 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse. And the gearbox was accessed through a side cover that any reasonably skilled mechanic could remove with basic tools. If something broke on an F-20 in a county without a dealer nearby, there was usually a man within 10 miles who could fix it. That repairability was never advertised on a spec sheet. It didn't show up in International Harvester's sales brochures, but it was perhaps the most important specification the machine had. Today, the Farmall F-20 occupies an interesting position in the collector world. It's not as rare as some of its contemporaries, The sheer volume produced means there are still a significant number out there, in varying states of preservation. But genuine running examples in original condition are becoming harder to find with each passing year. The men and women who bought these tractors new are long gone. The farms many of them saved have passed through multiple generations of hands. Some still in agriculture, many converted to other uses. What remains are the machines themselves and the stories that traveled with them. The restoration community around Farmall tractors is active and dedicated. Regional shows across the Midwest frequently feature F-20s alongside their successors, and there's something notable about watching a machine that was built during the darkest economic period of the 20th century run cleanly at an agricultural fair in the 21st. That the tractor outlasted the crisis. It outlasted the farm it saved, in many cases. In some families, it outlasted 3 generations of owners and is now in the hands of a grandchild who never met the man who drove it first. That's a kind of continuity that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the original machine was built with enough integrity to survive being handed down. Earl Whitmore ran his F-20 until 1951, when his son Robert returned from Korea and decided the farm needed something newer. Earl let him buy a Farmall M, but the F-20 didn't leave the property. It sat behind the equipment shed for years, used occasionally for light work around the yard, then less occasionally, then not at all. It had been sitting under a corrugated metal lean-to for better than 20 years. The tires were flat. The magneto needed rebuilding, and one of the carburetor needles was frozen solid. She spent 8 months bringing it back. Today it runs. The paint on it is a careful recreation of the original Farmall red, though she debated leaving the original faded surface exactly as it was found. What decided her was a photograph she found tucked inside the owner's manual. Her grandfather Earl, standing next to the tractor in the summer of 1939, one hand on the steering wheel, squinting into the sun. He looked, she said, it's like a man who'd just won something. $5, a bent fender bracket, an idol that sounded like it meant business. That's the Farmall F-20. That's what it did for the people who needed it most. And that's why, more than 80 years after the last one rolled out of the Rock Island factory, we're still talking about it. If this story moved you, if you heard something in Earl's $5 bid that resonated with your own connection to these machines, then you know what this channel is about. Drop a comment below with your own Farmall story or the tractor that meant the most to someone in your family. We rate everyone. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next one. These machines didn't just work the land, they held it together. And some of them are still out there, waiting to be found.